A less obvious but also interesting thing to note is that Putin rehabilitated the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact at exactly the same time that the Russian Federation is pursuing a strategy of contacts with the extreme right in Europe, right? And in fact, it's the same strategy. The reason why Stalin made an alliance with Hitler was to turn European energies against themselves. The reason why Putin makes an alliance with the European far right is to destroy the European Union. It's the exact same line of thinking. But what I would like to suggest is that there's something even deeper going on here, something even more worrisome. Because, of course, to rehabilitate the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is to rehabilitate the Second World War. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was the way the Second World War began. Hitler was looking for an ally, and he found one who allowed him to begin the Second World War. There might have been another Second World War, but the one which began with the Soviet-German alliance is, as it were, the only one that we have. So when we think of all of the crimes of the Second World War, when we think of what followed during the Second World War, we have to begin with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Now, it's easiest to begin with the Soviet crimes, which followed 1939, when the Soviet Union invaded eastern Poland, invaded the Baltic states, committed the massacres at Katyn, deported 500,000 Polish citizens and other people. But there's also a deeper abyss here. There's a deeper abyss here. Because if you begin the war in 1939, you notice something else. You notice something very interesting. When we look at the war through our own prism, when we look at the war through our own Western prism of memory, the memory of the Holocaust, we notice something very interesting, and in a way, very threatening, something which, especially in the context of the murder of Boris Nemtsov, I find very, very frightening. And that is the uninvestigated way in which the Holocaust proceeded in the Soviet Union. When we think of the Holocaust here in the West, we think of camps, we think of trains. But of course, the way the Holocaust began was as a shooting campaign in Eastern Europe, which was carried out by Germans, tens of thousands of Germans, the Einsatzgruppen, the Ordnungspolizei, many from the Wehrmacht, and so on, and by a couple of 100,000 local people of many ethnicities. The one thing that almost all of them had in common was a Soviet passport. And they had either joined the Soviet Union in 1939 or 1940, when the Soviet Union expanded westwards, or they were citizens of the pre-war Soviet Union. Either way, the Holocaust as it began, and the Holocaust in which half of the Jewish victims died, was carried out on the territories which had been the Soviet Union, with the massive collaboration of Soviet citizens. I say Soviet citizens because all attempts to classify them by ethnicity have to fail. Attempts to classify them by ethnicity is usually someone's nationalism fighting against someone else's nationalism. Now, the Holocaust took place all the way east as far as German troops went. It took place in Smolensk, it took place in Kaluga. As far east as German troops went, Russians and others took part in the Holocaust. I stress this not to single out Russians, who behaved exactly as everyone else did in this situation. I say this to stress that there is a great uninvestigated chapter of history here, a great unconfronted chapter of history here. And the question that I'm trying to ask now, or the question I'm moving forward towards is, what does it mean to rehabilitate 1939? What does it mean to rehabilitate an alliance with Adolf Hitler when there is no prior confrontation with Nazi war crimes on your own territory? Or simultaneously, what does it mean to rehabilitate the history of the Soviet Union when part of the history of the Soviet Union is precisely the history of contact with Nazi Germany? Now, of course, there is a traditional strategy here. All of this history that I've discussed, all of these crimes that took place in the occupied Soviet Union, they're not unknown. Of course, Soviet authorities knew about them. In fact, we know about them from Soviet sources and from the recollections of Soviet citizens, Jews and others. But there's a particular way in which these crimes, or the memory of these crimes, or the political energy arising from these crimes has been used, has been channeled historically. In the Soviet Union, what happened is that the memory of these crimes, the blame for these crimes was channeled towards ethnicities who were disliked for other reasons. Therefore, Soviet propaganda tried very hard to associate the Holocaust with Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, and West Ukrainians, which in a way was perfectly justified. There were plenty of Holocaust perpetrators in those countries. But there were also just as many Holocaust perpetrators in other places, including Russia, which escaped blame almost entirely. The other traditional strategy, and I realize some of you will remember this, was to export blame for all these crimes to the West, to the capitalist system, to fascism, right, as a general category. So the bad things which happened in the Soviet Union in the Second War were exported to the West, either to these small nationalities or to the West, the capitalist West, as such. And then, of course, the myth of the Great Fatherland War is that all of this evil is undone. Now, you'll understand why I'm stressing this. Because this export of history, or this export of responsibility for history, and I think responsibility is the crucial word, the export of responsibility for history is happening again in a very similar way. Just as then, so now, blame for the Soviet past or blame for the Nazi past in the Soviet Union is exported, is externalized. Now all of the Ukrainians are somehow fascists, right? Even though Ukraine suffered proportionally much more than Russia in the Second World War, now the Ukrainians as such are presented as fascists. The blame is ethnicized again. The idea of fascism and the West as backers of fascism has been resuscitated, right? That is also very familiar, that there's this fascist junta somehow and the West is behind it. That's Soviet reasoning. That's familiar, but what I'm trying to ask, and what's new, is what it means to resuscitate these Soviet-style myths, this Soviet way of exporting responsibility at the same time that you rehabilitate cooperation with Nazi Germany. This is where things start to get truly dark and truly strange. I mean, or to put it in a sharper way, what does it mean to be a pro-fascist, anti-fascist? Right? Or what does it mean to be an anti-fascist, pro-fascist? What does it mean to embrace both of these legacies at the same time? In Russia, I think what it means, unfortunately, is the shift of the myth of the war from a defensive war to an offensive war. And I could be wrong, I don't think so, but in May we're going to see the commemoration of the Great Fatherland War as a defensive war, of course, as a justification for the offensive war in Ukraine. There's a slippage of Russian memory going on in which a defensive war is becoming an offensive war. But in the West, and this is where I want to conclude, and of course this is the most important point, in the West, what's being exported is a giant, giant contradiction. A giant contradiction in which we're supposed to watch as Russia moves way to the right, and yet at the same time accept that Russia claims that everyone else is way to the right. Okay, and these are the second and final parts of my remarks.